Welcome to the Joe Monroe Show. Now, here's your host, Joe Monroe.
Whoa, hello everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of the Joe Monroe Show. It is me, Joe Monroe. And you're probably thinking to yourself, Joe, who in the world is crazy enough to help you with your own show? Well, I have friends. I have cameraman Steve right behind the camera. I have my producer David here. And I have me. And there's also a few others I want to thank before we get started. I want to thank I gotta say that? Okay. The great Brandon T. Wilson for providing us with that lovely intro and the lovely outro that you'll see later on in the show. I also want to thank the Nice Guy Andy podcast for supporting me 100% with this and for giving me some topics and also helping me with the setup. I think it's pretty cool, especially Mr. Polar Bear here. And I also want to... do I have to single him out? I do? Okay, well, flip the card over. I also want to thank Superfly Johnny Lee for his courageous and... What? A second, folks. I want to thank Superfly Johnny Lee for his courageous and most intelligent smarts about... What? Who wrote that? You wrote that? You're not going to talk, are you? God. What am I going to do? Okay. I want to... forget it. Johnny, thank you. There you go. That's all you're getting out of me. I'm not calling you Superfly. Damn it. Sammy say Superfly. God. All right. Enough of that. Let's get on with today's topic. Today... it was very hard for me to choose. I was going to talk about World Class Championship Wrestling and the Von Erichs, but that will be for a later time. I was also going to talk about a few horror films, but I was like, nah, I can't start off like that. People know me for wrestling. So who would be great to incorporate both professional wrestling and horror? Only one man come to mind. Rowdy Roddy Piper. Now, this is the They Live Elite that came in the Hollywood line of elites. I'll be talking about a little later on. This will be part 2. Now, I just want to talk about part 1. I want to talk about Roddy's wrestling career from 1973 until 1987, when he decided to become an actor and take a break from pro wrestling, which, to me, was smart. But I'll get into that in episode 2. Now, Piper grew up not in one place. He moved from place to place as a kid. He never remembered having an established home. So much that he grabbed his bagpipes and left home at age 13. From then on, he was considered a nomad, going from one group hostile to another. Until at the age of 15, a priest came to him and stated, Roderick, which is his real name, Roderick, if you don't do something with your life, then your life's not going to end too well. So that was kind of an epiphany moment, especially for someone at a young age. Now, at this time, Piper already had an amateur background in wrestling. And supposedly he also won a Golden Gloves in boxing, but there's no really supporting documentation on that except for what Piper has stated in his book and what he stated in interviews. So I want to take the man's word for it because those strikes look pretty legit in his matches. He started his wrestling career in Churchill, Manitoba with promoter Al Tomko. Sorry, I had to look at that name, make sure I was reading that right. If you're Canadian and I'm mispronouncing some of these names, I am not sorry. Now, during his first event, it included midget wrestlers and lumberjacks. No, literally, lumberjacks. Paul Bunyan people. And the ring was not really a ring. It was just a few ropes tied to posts in 4 corners and a wrestling mat, an amateur wrestling mat. But they went ahead and put on the show anyways, because in pro wrestling, the show must go on. I firmly believe in that. Now, he didn't get his first big break with a major promotion until a few months later with the AWA. Now, as someone who would love to be in the major promotion one day, I wouldn't love to have been in Piper's shoes, because he had to work against Larry Hennig, the father of Mr. Perfect, Curt Hennig. Now, if for all the younger folks who don't know who Larry Hennig is, over 6 foot tall and weighed over 300 pounds, versus Roddy Piper, who's a little under 6 foot and weighed maybe 165 pounds, and scrawny. You're already reading my mind. Don't skip ahead of me here. But not only was this the first major wrestling promotion that Piper wrestled for, this was also the first time Roddy Piper was mentioned in the world. Why? Because he was part of a pipe band that was mainly in Toronto, I do believe. And since this was a major wrestling company, they agreed to play him to the ring. Now, the promoter and the announcer only knew him as Roddy. So what the announcer decided to do last minute was, ladies and gentlemen, coming down to the ring, Roddy the Piper. Thus, the name Roddy Piper was born. Thank goodness it was born. But not so thankful going back to Larry Hennig. This was also a record for Piper. As Piper would put it, the bell rung, then the bell rung. Match only lasted 10 seconds, and that was it. So as he's hobbling to the back, he thought he was going to get an earful from the promoter. And the promoter goes, "Kid, that was great. How would you like to go to Kansas City?" First thought in Piper's mind was, Larry Hennig going to be there? Of course, and thankfully Piper said yes, because this is the point in his life that I think pro wrestling saved it. It saved him right here. That decision to go to Kansas City saved his life. No matter how much they tested him, because back in the 70s, they would test younger guys. Now, they do that nowadays, but not as bad as what they did back in the day, which most people would call it hazing. We call it ribbing. And those guys would take it too far sometimes. But I'm not here to talk about the bad times. I'm here to talk about the good times. Now, during 1973 and 1975, Piper was known as a job guy. Now, jobbers are mainly there to lose. But with that, you also get work experience. You get ring awareness. And you get training. Here's something that you can quote me on. And I'm going to give you some free advice here. You never stop training in professional wrestling. You always learn something new. Now, at this time, he would go on to work in Canada, Kansas City, Texas, back into Canada in a couple of towns, over in Japan, which he stated he didn't like, then right back down to Texas in the Dallas area with the Von Erichs, and finally, where he would get his kind of big break in Los Angeles. Now, you're wondering, why did he wrestle in so many promotions? Well, like today's wrestlers on the independent scene, if you want your name out there, you got to travel. Now, I know most folks can't because they have families, but there's also people out there that grind, and hats off to you for grinding that hard. But back in the day, at this time, he's 15, 16, 17. His teenage years was on the road. So moving and moving, I guess he was used to it already how he was raised. But that's tough. That's got to be really tough on him. But let's get back into it. We're in Los Angeles, California. Now, in LA, a little tidbit that people don't really know about. I read this in Piper's book, and I couldn't believe it. If you haven't read it, it's called In the Pit with Piper. Read it. It's wonderful. He was best friends with Andy Kaufman. I did not know that. I didn't know he was best friends. I didn't know Andy Kaufman knew who Roddy Piper was. But seeing how the character of Roddy Piper is and seeing how Andy Kaufman is, I can kind of see them kind of feeding off each other. Because Piper was no stranger to controversy. And neither was Andy Kaufman, as we would learn later in Memphis. I will get into that in a later episode. But just tidbit, did you know? Because, quite honestly, I didn't know. I did not know that. So I thought that was kind of cool. But within Los Angeles, again, Piper was still this scrawny 160, 170 pound kid. Was basically a toothpick, and all the other big guys can just throw around. So the promoter decided to put him in a match with Java Ruck, also known as Johnny Rods, who would go on to train the likes of Taz, Tommy Dreamer, and Devon Dudley. Now, since Piper was a jobber, Java just beat him without mercy. But here's the genius part. Afterwards, Piper decided, if I can't beat him, I'm going to join him. And this is where Piper found his voice. Because Java was just from Saudi Arabia. So he couldn't really talk that much. So you get someone like Roddy Piper, who has pent-up rage for the past 18, 19 years at this point. You give that kid a microphone, he's going to say a lot. And he did. He worked on that for 6 months and didn't stop. Until they decided to make him into some kind of hypnotist, and he's like, nah, this is bullcrap. I don't want to do this. So with that in mind, they said, okay, Piper, we're finally going to give you a break here. That's when I think Rowdy Roddy Piper was born, right there. With him being in the manager, and take it personally with someone who talks and does promos, that's when you finally define your character, when you're able to let them out, so to speak. And Roddy was able to let Piper out. Now, after this stint was 6 months with Java, he finally got his first big feud with Chavo Guerrero Sr. Now, most people don't know this. They probably know Eddie Guerrero, Chavo Guerrero Jr., and maybe Chavo Guerrero Sr. if you were a fan of SmackDown back in the mid-2000s. But the Guerrero family was like the equivalent to the Hart family of Mexico. They wrestled for generations upon generations. I can't remember how far back. I will get into the Guerrero family and Eddie Guerrero eventually. But at this time, Los Angeles was mainly Hispanic people. And the TV that they got was mainly a Hispanic network. Which is why there was a problem with what Roddy did. To start off the feud, Roddy decided it was smart to bring out a zebra-painted donkey, which according to him at that time they did in Tijuana, and a t-shirt that stated Conqueror of the Guerreros, and then went on to basically verbally abuse the whole crowd that night. This didn't go over too well. So much that the TV network got so many complaints that they demanded Roddy Piper to apologize the next week. So the next week, Roddy Piper went on there and said, you know what, as an apology, I will learn how to play the national anthem of Mexico for you all. And the crowd was like, okay, because at this point, they knew that Roddy could play the bagpipes. So about a week or so goes by, and he decided, I got it. I finally learned the Mexican national anthem, and I will be playing it for you next week. Next week rolls around. Gets in the ring. He said, would you all please stand for Mexico's national anthem? Everybody gracefully stands up, hands over their hearts. People take off their hats. Piper goes into the bagpipes and starts playing La Cucaracha, La Cucaracha, da-da-da-da-da. He wasn't able to get it finished. Because you talk about some people being madder than hornets. They had chairs bolted down in the arena they would have the shows at. Needless to say, those bolts went flying, and so did the chairs. And according to Piper, the knives came out too. And needless to say, that show was immediately cut short because of that. Now, after Los Angeles, Piper would go on into Portland territory. Now, this is where most people recognize Piper. If you didn't know about him and Guerrero for the feud they had for that 3-year span, then you know Piper from Portland, which started in 1978. Now, at this time, he became a Pacific Northwest Tag Team Champions with Killer Tim Brooks and Rick Martel. And not only did he win the Tag Team Championships, he won the NWA Pacific Northwest Heavyweight Championships with wins and victories over Playboy Buddy Roberts and Lord Jonathan Boyd. I think I said that right. Yeah, I said that right. Now, not only did he go on to win championship accomplishment here, but he also met the love of his wife Kitty, at a diner. Thanks to Killer Brooks kind of ribbing him to ask her out on a date. You gotta love your friends, right? Now, after Portland, Piper had a little brief stint in the WWF. Oh, I'm sorry, am I allowed to say that? Okay, I'll say it this way. The World Wrestling Federation. He wrestled 5 matches under Vince McMahon Sr., with his first match winning against a very familiar foe that I will get into later, Frankie Williams. People who already know Piper should also know who Frankie Williams is. Patience. Now, in the early 1980s, he started traveling over to the Carolinas with Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, going on to defeat Jack Briscoe for the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Championship, and also defeating Ric Flair for the U.S. title, which both of those turned into major feuds. If you want to see those feuds, I urge you to go on Peacock. I know they have those rivalries there. Go check them out, because that is when Piper started growing. Every territory that he went to, you will notice, I wish they had Portland on there and some of Los Angeles. But even if you start at Mid-Atlantic and go on, maybe you'll be able to find some of his earlier stuff on YouTube. But he starts to grow. He starts to evolve. And that's awesome to see, especially from someone who wrestles, because that's what I want to do. That's what someone in my shoes wants to see. We want to see ourselves evolve in time. Piper sure as heck did that. Especially with his wrestling skills. Man, he gotten better with time. Now, his mic skills got way better with time. And as everyone knows, his mic skills strong point, and eventually so was his wrestling. Now, from 1981 to 1982, Piper would work as a commentator for Georgia Championship Wrestling, and will feud with the likes of Bob Armstrong, Dick Slater, and Tommy Rich. I didn't know that. He weren't Wildfire Tommy Rich? Former NWA World Champion. I didn't know that. Now I know. Anyways. Now, during the summer of 1982, he started becoming a fan favorite in Georgia Championship Wrestling by knocking out Don Morocco and Ole Anderson, because they were coming after the commentator, and Piper said, nope, we're not having that today. And that's when Piper decided to be a good guy. And they would go on to work until Piper's released later that year for being late for a wrestling match. He would return later to help Tommy Rich with Buzz Sawyer, and that was the last you would see Piper in Georgia Championship Wrestling. Now, he would return to Mid-Atlantic for a little bit and came back as a fan favorite, working up against Sergeant Slaughter, Ric Flair again, and working Greg the Hammer Valentine. Now, if I mention Roddy Piper and Greg the Hammer Valentine, you know what match that immediately comes to mind. The dog collar match of Starrcade 83. Now, little known fact, people don't know, Roddy Piper was the one that got those materials together. Till the day he passed away, he 100% regretted doing that, because that was a rough match. So rough that Piper ended up losing 50% of his hearing from his left ear. Again, if you have Peacock, go watch Starrcade 83. Not only for this match, but that event is so historic to the wrestling community. It's chef's kiss. That was the precursor to WrestleMania in a way. Because not only did you have matches like this, But you also had the match with Flair and Harley Race, which is one of my favorite Ric Flair matches and one of my favorite Harley Race matches. So, and there's a few others. It's been a while since I've seen it, but those two matches within themselves stand out. So I would urge you to go and watch that match and watch the event itself if you get some time, preferably around Thanksgiving. It's kind of an inside joke there. Anyways, during this time, Piper may have lost 50% of his hearing, but he also came out with the win. Now, a little later on, Piper would get a call from Vince McMahon asking him to come work for the World Wrestling Federation. Piper was ready to come, but Vince asked him to go ahead and fulfill his contract with the Crockett's, who ran Mid-Atlantic at that time. And Piper said, okay. Then, beginning in 1984, we started seeing Roddy Piper appear in the World Wrestling Federation, but not quite yet as a wrestler. He came on as manager, managing the likes of Dr. David Schultz and his good friend Paul Orndorff, Mr. Wonderful himself. They will have a history throughout his World Wrestling Federation run here, which we're about to get into. Now, a few months of him doing this, Roddy would gradually work his way into in-ring action. But before then, everybody's favorite talk show, Piper's Pit, was born. Now, I talked about Frankie Williams just a few moments ago. Everybody remembers Frankie Williams from the very famous Piper Pits episode where he says, I'm from the Columbus, Ohio. And Piper said from then on, the rest was history for Piper's Pit. Because if Frankie was true and be like, well, we came from Puerto Rico, then we immigrated to Columbus, it would have been dead in the water. But since he said I'm from the Columbus, Ohio, Roddy was able to work with it on the fly. And from then on, he had guests such as Andre the Giant and Superfly Jimmy Snuka. Now, why are those three the ones that stand out with Frankie Williams, Andre, and Jimmy Snuka? Frankie Williams ended with the quote, just when they think they got the answers, I change the questions. And Andre, for one, Andre basically saying that's none of your business to Piper with every question he had, and ripped Piper's shirt off his back, then walked away. Piper ended the show with this quote, you do not throw rocks at a man who has a machine gun. Now, Piper would go on to say he has no idea where any of those quotes came from. It's just something that came off the top of his head. This would later on help him with his acting career as well, because he would help write one-liners like that in They Live and Hell Comes to Frogtown. But let's get back into the wrestling. So during the time with Piper's Pit, he would hire a bodyguard named Ace Cowboy Bob Orton. Now, Cowboy Bob Orton wore a cast on his wrist. Actually, give me just a second. There you are, Ace. Ace's elite figure, if you don't have it, get it. He would wear a cast on his arm like this. Now, supposedly, this cast wasn't healing his wrist at all. But he would use this as a weapon. And, honestly, I kind of admire him for it. Alright, get out of here, Ace. Now, they were basically unstoppable. They were I hate to say it, they were a dynamic duo. And they worked so well together. So much that they finally got recognized with the Rock and Wrestling Connection. Now, Piper never won the World Wrestling Federation title. Personally, I think it's a crime, but going back and looking at his career the past few weeks of me studying him, Piper didn't need it. Now, would it have been awesome to see him with the world title? Abso-freaking-lutely. Did he deserve it? Abso-freaking-lutely. Was it one of his regrets? He said it did kind of bug him, but it wouldn't have mattered either way. Now, the next major feud he would have is with Hulk Hogan. Now, this started on MTV's The War to Settle the Score, because at this point, Hogan was getting hazed by Piper from left and right. Now, In the tradition of pro wrestling, if the bad guy's going to keep talking trash, then the good guy has to settle the score with him. Well, it didn't really get settled. It just got started. Because the match ended up in a brawl. So bad that Cyndi Lauper, yes, the singer from Girls Just Want to Have Fun, ended up getting kicked in the head by Roddy Piper. Now, this started something that I think shouldn't have happened, because, as you know, Piper grew up old school. And having celebrities come in, yeah, it did help the World Wrestling Federation into global status, into mainstream status. But if you're old school like Piper was, there's no sense in somebody like Cyndi Lauper or Mr. T getting in the ring, which caused a lot of friction between him and Mr. T in their rivalry, which we're about to jump into. Thanks to this brawl and for Piper to kicking Cyndi Lauper in the head, this led to the very first WrestleMania main event. Now, he was able to drag his old friend Paul Orndorff into this, but the Hogan was able to drag an old foe of Piper's in as well, with Superfly Jimmy Snuka. Now, a few months prior to that, everybody knows the story of Snuka and the coconut. And ever since then, he got a little bit of Piper, but he always wanted to come after him because of that incident, because it embarrassed him. Quite frankly, it would embarrass me if someone hit me over the head with a coconut and continued to whip me with a belt, and I couldn't go after him right then and there. Whew. That was scary. Yeah, that was scary. Did you not see the guy's eyes? It was scary. Go back and watch it. Anyways, this led up to the very first main event of WrestleMania, which included Piper, Paul Orndorff, and Cowboy Bob Orton against Hulk Hogan, Superfly Jimmy Snuka, and Mr. T. Here we go with the problem with Mr. T and Piper. Piper did not like this. Piper, he just didn't see celebrities coming into the wrestling ring and stepping in basically in his territory. Like, this is something that's protective, and a lot of us are protective of it. This is our bread and butter. This is something that we love. This is something we break our backs about. Then you're going to have someone in celebrity status just come in and waltz around the ring like it's a dog and pony show? Piper took exception to this. But, unfortunately, they did not come out with the win. But thanks to Cowboy Bob Orton accidentally hitting Paul Orndorff in the back with the cast. Way to go, Ace. And Piper was so upset that he just left Paul Orndorff in the ring. And him and Cowboy Bob Orton just stormed off. Now, with the antics of WrestleMania, this led to a challenge made by Piper and Cowboy Bob Orton. You're probably thinking right now WrestleMania 2. Close. Not many people know that Cowboy Bob Orton actually faced Mr. T in a boxing match at Saturday night's main event, which of course ended with Cowboy Bob Orton and Roddy Piper beating the crap out of him afterwards. Then that led into the infamous WrestleMania 2 boxing match between Piper and Mr. T. Now, they went 4 rounds, and then Piper stated he's had enough and just body slammed Mr. T within about 1 minute and 10 seconds within the 4th round. And from that point on, Piper took a little bit of a break. But when he came back in late 1986, he wasn't really too pleased. Because at this point, his show Piper's Pit was basically taken over by Adrian Adonis' flower shop. Now, Adrian Adonis and Piper have a long history with each other, going back to the 70s. And he really didn't like anybody but shadowing over the pit. Because Piper's Pit was Piper's bread and butter. So they would go at it with segments against each other for a few months. Then they finally was able to have a segment together, which ended in Piper getting jumped by Adrian Adonis, Cowboy Bob Orton, who at this time decided to join Adrian Adonis as his personal bodyguard and Piper's old friend Don Morocco. No, not really old friend, more like a foe. Then whenever Piper came back, there is an interview you can watch on YouTube. Piper hands a note. Well, wanted to hand a note to Jimmy Hart, but they refused. So he read off the rating systems, in which Adrian Adonis's wasn't that great, and the flower shop was eventually canceled. They couldn't believe it, and as Jimmy Hart, who was the manager of Adrian Adonis at the time, read it off, Piper, with a baseball bat, went ballistic on the flower shop and wrecked it. This would lead to the hair versus hair match at WrestleMania 3. Now, this, in my mind, is one of Piper's most underrated matches ever. If you have not seen this match, again, I want to plug Peacock. Go watch it on Peacock or YouTube or wherever you can. This match is so underrated, it's not even funny. Adrian Adonis himself is so underrated. I'll probably end up talking about him in my later episodes. But WrestleMania 3 wasn't just about the hair versus hair match. Now, with Piper's pit being torn down when he was jumped, he was able to get a more permanent setting. Now, there was build-ups for WrestleMania 3. There was Savage and Steamboat, Piper and Adonis, and the most famous, Andre and Hulk Hogan. And the Andre and Hogan started on an episode of Piper's Pit. I have a feeling Piper and Hogan just cross each other's paths a lot. Wait for episode 2, people. Wait for episode 2. Now, let's go back to the hair versus hair match. With the hair versus hair match, this was also built up as Roddy Piper's retirement match. Because at this point in time, he wanted to focus on acting. Roddy Piper went on to win the match. And poor Adrian got his hair cut. Now, there's a few things I want to say. To the naysayers who said I couldn't do this, I did it. This is my show. I got a few friends helping me, and I got people supporting me. So bug off. And to the people that don't like me, and is probably going to troll me over the comments saying this was a bad show and I didn't like it, blah, 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 blah. Well, let's see you do this, pal. Let's see you do your own show and do all the editing and stuff with some dipstick producer and a great-looking camera guy. You're welcome, Steve. But this is the end of episode 1. Now, episode 2, I will be talking about They Live. If you want to, I urge you to go and find it and go and watch it. I don't think it's on any streaming platforms right now, but you can rent it on Vudu or Amazon or wherever you decide to rent your films. And also, please, please, please go check out those matches I mentioned. The dog collar match, the WrestleMania matches. I mean, Piper was so underrated that he does not get, in my mind, the recognition that he deserves. Now, this was the very first episode of the Joe Monroe Show. I hope to see you all next time.
You've been listening to the Joe Monroe Show with Joe Monroe. Don't forget to like and subscribe.